ki he mauri o. Ko te mea tuatahi ki te atua te rawa nāna I hanga mea katoa nāna e whakai ana ki o tātou nei tikanga o tēnā o ngai o te motu o te waipaunamu o te wakamaui o te upuko o te ika o te ika maui. Tēnei te mihi atu ki a koutou no ngā hau e whai. I utaina mai o koutou waka ki tēnei whare, te whare wānanga o tātou ki pōneke. Nei rā te mihi atu nā mātou o Ngāti Tōrangatira, o Taranaki Whānui, o Ngāti Raukawa, e mihi kawana ki o koutou waka I utaina mai, ki te tautoko, ki te awhi, te au whikitanga o te ahurangi, te manutaki, tēnā koe e whirimu, me mā whānau I taia mai, ki te whānau a Levack, tēnā koutou. Koutou hoki e nau whānau I ngā hoa mahi, no tā wahi, rātou rā, ki te ipurangi, tēnā koutou, no tā wahi o te waipounamu, mihi kawana tēnei ki o koutou katoa. He rā whakahirihira nei mo tēnei, hari te ngākau ki te whakarongo, te taenga mai o tēnei rā, whakaaupiki mō te manutaki nei ki tāna ahorangi tamau. Huri noa, ki te whai o te whare, e mihi ana ki a koe, te manu tiori e karangatia rā, tō kaha ki te karanga, ki ngā tinimate, ki ngā whānau, no tā wahi o te ao, tēnā koe e whaia. Uri noa, e kui mai e koromā, e kore mātou e wareware, ngā tāonga whakahirihiro o tātou. Mā ngā kite o te wānanga, I riro ai no whea, no ngā rangi tūharaha, no tāne te waiora, ka puta mai te mātauranga mō tātou katoa. Iaha te kaupapa mō tēnei pō, he pō whakanuia, he pō whakaaupiki, he pō whakamārama ki tana haerenga, o tana mahi, o tana pūkenga, kei roto te whare wānanga o tākau, tai no atu ki te hāpore Māori, ki te hāpore o Aotearoa. Koena te kaha o te rangatira nei, e mihi kawana tēnei ki a koe, ki te awhi o whaia e te manutaki tuarua, ki a koe Dawn, tēnā mahuki koe ki te awhi ki te tautoko, ena, kotora, tēnā koutou. Huri noa te whānau, tēnā tātou katoa, ka hui.
Te tako
Kia koto katoa, ngā tini mate ua whiturangi tia haere, ngā kanahi ora, tēnā koutou, whakatau mai koutou kei roto te ware nei. Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, ko Donalda Tapu. It is my pleasure as Deputy Dean at Te Whare Waianga Otago Maneki to welcome you to our campus for this important occasion, the inaugural Professorial lecture of our Dean, Professor William Levack. Nā mai haere mai. First, I bring apologies from Professor Paul Brunton, Pro-Vice Chancellor of Health Sciences, who could not be here in person today. He has a recorded message for us, and we will listen to that now.
Tēnā tātou katoa, no ingarangi aho. Ke otipoti taku kainga, ko Pennines te maunga, ko Mersey te awa, ko Ngāti Pākehā toku iwi, ko te wahanga mātua mātou hawora toku marae, ko Paul Brunton toku inwa. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Well, good evening everybody, and welcome to the inaugural professorial lecture for William Levack. Now, normally the Vice-Chancellor and myself, I'm the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Health Sciences here at the University, would normally attend an IPL, but unfortunately on this occasion we're both unable to be physically present. So I did just want to welcome everybody. And just to point out that to become a professor at the University of Otago is incredibly difficult. We have very high academic standards, and to be promoted to being a professor is an endorsement of people's academic activity, both in teaching research but also in academic service, both to the university and the wider community. It's a celebratory event and a chance for the new professor to introduce themselves as a professor to their community. I'm sure this evening will go really well, and I wish William all the very best, and I hope you all enjoy your evening. Thank you very much for your attention.
So again, on behalf of the campus here, I'd like to add to that welcome. And I'd also like to acknowledge our special guest today, Professor David Murdoch, Dean of the University of Otago, Christchurch. Tēnā koutou, David. Thank you for coming and joining us in the academic party. It's very special to have us with you supporting William. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to William's whānau today, his wife Jo, his children, Gilbert, Eva and Casper, and his parents, Hamish and Glenys Levack. Tēnā koutou. Welcome also to staff and students from the campus, friends, alumni of the university, and members of the public. Today we come from different paths to unite together to celebrate William's achievements and the knowledge and learning that he will share with us. Tui ki runga, tui ki raro, tui ki roto, tui ki waho, tui te here tangata, ka rongo te aho, ka rongo te po, homie, huie, tāua iwi. Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa. My colleague, Associate Professor Anna will introduce William to us, as he has been working in her department until recently. Thank you, Anna.
Haere mai. He waka e te ngawa, ki hei Māori rora. E te whare o te iwi, tēnā koe. E te whenua tapu o te Māria, tēnā koe. E rere haere anganga mihi ki Ngāti Toa, ki te Ātiawa, te mana whenua, o tēnei rohe. E ngā mate o Eoki, haere atura. Koutou kua hui hui mai, ngā kanohi ora o rātou, tēnā hoki koutou. No te amana o Okotupuna, no te amana aho, ko ana renta toko ingoa, ko ao te tuamaki o te tari whaiora. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome everybody. I'm Anna Rank, I'm the head of Department of Medicine, and I'm here really because usually this would be done by the Dean, but of course William is the Dean, and the Deputy Dean preceded me already doing a general welcome. So I have been given this great privilege to speak because in some small way William is still part of our department, or so we'd at least like to think. But mostly I report to him. So Professor Levack, William, you completed your physiotherapy degree degree at Otago in 1995 and worked as a clinical physiotherapist at Kaplan Coast PhD and also at Cabot ABI. But then he got the itch and decided he wanted to do a bit more. And you completed your Master's in Health Sciences Rehabilitation in 2003, followed by a PhD in 2008, also at Otago. You joined the Otago staff member as an Otago staff member in 2003 as a lecturer for the Rehabilitation Teaching and Research Unit within the Department of Medicine, and have proven to be an outstanding educator, contributing to program development and convening with consistently outstanding student feedback. You've also served as Associate Dean of Research from 2011 to 2019, and also carried additional responsibility for postgraduate studies during that time. In 2017, you promoted to Associate Professor, and of course now you've so deservedly been promoted to Professor, which we're celebrating tonight. William's research has been focused on goal planning, motivation, and management in rehabilitation. Conditions that have held a special interest for William include respiratory disease, traumatic brain injury, neurological conditions, generally, and stroke in particular, which of course is the most important part. Associated themes include loss, change, and reconstruction of self-identity following brain injury, interprofessional rehabilitation processes, qualitative research methods, and systematic reviews. As a matter of fact, on that front, William helped establish the Cochrane Rehabilitation in 2016 as a new field within the Cochrane collaboration, which is a major accomplishment, and he has since served on the executive board for that group. He collaborates with researchers all over the world, including Italy, the UK, Pakistan, Malaysia, Japan, Germany, and the list goes on. He has written a textbook, 9 book chapters, over 80 peer-reviewed publications, over 70 conference abstracts, and has been invited to give many invited lectures. Outside the university, you've been a significant contributor since 2007 and the current president of the New Zealand Rehabilitation Association. He's also still a registered physiotherapist, and he is, of course, our esteemed dean. So I've worked with you as a member of my department, as a research collaborator, and now under your leadership as dean here at UOW. And I honestly have to say, I could not be more pleased to have you as part of my professional life and serve under your amazing leadership. You've been thrown into the deep end amidst a pandemic. What dean can say that? I suppose David can. And various other challenges. And I think I speak for the entire senior leadership team here when I say that your honest, open, transparent, inclusive, genuine, intelligent, and wise, measured, and highly collaborative approach has made you a cherished leader of our collective community. Finally, William, you're also my friend, and I so very much value that friendship. Not only are you a great teacher, researcher, and leader, you're also a super cool human being, and I thank you for that. So it's my great pleasure to invite you, William, to present your inaugural professorial lecture.
Ka tangata titi, ka tangata kāka, ka tangi hoki ahau. Tihei Māori ora. Tēnā koutou, ko upoko te ika te rohi, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Appin Stewart me Levack nā whānau, no Kotorana, ara ko Scotland, ko Hamish, ko Rawa ko Glenys, oku mātua, ko Joe, toku whaiapo, ko, I'm going to cry already, ko Gilbert, ko Eva, ko Casper, oku tamariki, ko William, toko ingoa. Ko te manutaki ki te whare wānanga o Otago ki Poneke. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, kia ora kātou katoa. I'm very nervous about this talk, and it's been very interesting preparing for this. It's something I have been struck by how personal this sort of event is, and I've been saying to people today that I think all professions should have an episode like this. That 3/4 of the way through your job as a rubbish truck driver or whatever, you should stop and gather your friends in whānau to talk about the last your career to the date and the people who supported you to get to that point. Thank you very much for the wonderful welcome from our Waiata group and from Toa Waka, and thank you too for the lovely speeches to begin with. So, my presentation is about my work, and the title of this presentation is Meaningful Research, Meaningful Lives. I want to focus today on themes within my research that are to do with what matters to people, and the people that I'm interested in is users of rehabilitation services. I'm also interested in how best to help people engage in and take charge of their own rehabilitation, and how best to develop a robust and meaningful evidence base to guide clinical decision making in rehabilitation. It's useful for us all to have a shared understanding about what rehabilitation is before I go on too much further, so I just wanted to clarify a few issues. One thing that's often a misconception is that rehabilitation is about curing people or fixing them. Rehabilitation is not really about curing people. That's the job of acute medical interventions. Rehabilitation is definitely not the fence at the top of the cliff or the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff, but often where the ambulance takes people to or the place after that. Rehabilitation is about helping people with disability and chronic health conditions maximise their functional abilities and their capacity to participate. That's often how it's described. I quite like thinking about rehabilitation from the perspective of a capabilities approach that was promoted by Amartya Sen, who's an economist, in fact. So from that perspective, we might think about rehabilitation as facilitating people with disabilities or chronic conditions to have the capabilities to fulfil their personal preferences. This way of thinking about things sort of minimises the emphasis so much on independence and permits interdependence and sort of like a community approach to recovery after injury. Rehabilitation can involve restoration of body structures and function. So that could be involve strengthening range of movement retraining, learning new skills, learning new executive functioning, and behaviour change. But sometimes, often, rehabilitation can also involve compensating for impairments that impact on functioning and participation. So at a person-centred level, that could involve giving someone with a weakness in their leg an orthotic to help support their leg during movement, or that compensation can occur at an environmental society perspective as well, by changing the attitudes of others or putting in a ramp instead of a flight of stairs for someone with a wheelchair to facilitate their ability to engage in work. One of the challenges for putting this presentation together is that my work's been sort of too diverse to make it easy to sort of like put together in one simple story. So my way around this is to tell 4 stories that cover quite a bit of territory in terms of the work that I've done to date. And I want to focus on 4 things, only vaguely connected. One is rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury. The second is about goal setting and rehabilitation. The third is about rehabilitation for chronic lung disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And the fourth is just touching on some of the work that I've been doing with Cochrane Rehabilitation around the development of methods for knowledge translation and evidence production. My career in science, however, didn't start in health sciences. My first study was in fact in biological sciences and were to do with slaters and earthworms that I dug out of the family compost. My work here was guided by my mum, who introduced me to experimental design, statistical tests, and the importance of a good control group. Just in case you're wondering, slaters prefer dark to light conditions. They prefer wet to dry conditions. And also they prefer, like most of us, they prefer cuddling rather than being by themselves. Slaters like cuddling with other slaters, not with people, just clarifying. So the first story I want to talk about is about research to do with rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury. In the late 1990s, I was working in KVWR Rehabilitation, which was a community-based provider group for people recovering after brain injury. And I was working as a physiotherapist on strengthening people's physical abilities and things after brain injury. And it struck me quite early on that the work we were doing as a team was broader than this focus on muscles and bones and range of movement. And so I became much more interested in community reintegration and how we facilitated that as an interprofessional team. Now at the same time, my partner Jo was studying social psychology at Victoria University, and she kept bringing home these texts to do with qualitative research methodologies, and that got me thinking about the potential value of qualitative research for exploring the lived experiences of people with traumatic brain injury. In fact, Jo actually published a peer-reviewed journal article before I did, and published a book chapter before I did as well, because she's kind of amazing. And I'd just also like to point out, in terms of the whakapapa of academic work within Poneke, Anne Weatherall, the co-author of this particular paper, is the sister of Professor Mark Weatherall, who's a great colleague from the Department of Medicine. Oh, just out of interest, I looked up last night about the impact of this particular publication, and it's been cited 240 times, which is pretty good for an honours study. Also, just a note of interest, this is a grounded theory study looking at the use of information technology by older adults prior to Facebook and smartphones and that kind of thing. Anyway, I had the good fortune to be tutored by Kath McPherson at the time that I was sort of developing these interests, and Kath came with a lot of experience in qualitative research, and so together we developed, along with Harry McNaughton, the study looking at the experiences of people trying to return to work after traumatic brain injury. And this paper that came out of it was looking at the question of whether or not we're evaluating what's most important when we're looking at recovery after brain injury. So around the time that I was doing this particular work, and probably arguably still today, work was considered one of the key measures of success in rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury. It was one of the main things that we evaluated, whether or not we've been successful in rehabilitation. And there's even sort of measures of success with return to work that grade or rate the people's outcomes in terms of the type of work they're performing. So the highest type of work is to do with competitive paid employment, and then you go down and you sort of like score lower points on this particular scale if you're working in a sheltered workshop or if you're unemployed. The findings from this particular research highlighted that while work was valued by participants, and everybody agrees having money is a good thing, maintaining work did not always align with feelings of success. Now, this is a study with a small number of participants, but even within these small stories, there were a number of notable situations where continuing with work had led to personal catastrophic events. People had invested so much energy to maintain themselves in the work environment that they had neglected their own home life. And some people had divorces. Another guy had been unable to maintain a steady job and had gone from job to job to job, which eventually ended in him knocking out one of his colleagues, and that was the end of his work in that particular place. And there's a quote here from someone who was saying, who lived alone, a person in their early 50s, that one of the reasons that nobody picked up how serious things were at work was because I'd go to bed with all my clothes on, and of course I'd get up again with all my clothes on, so nobody would know. So this person was sacrificing everything at home in order to be able to maintain their work environment. At the same time, there were stories that people were telling me about success they were experiencing in the workplace, or success they were experiencing outside the workplace that weren't related to return to work events. And also, there was interesting themes running through this work to do with people's perceptions of success in the workplace that were associated with factors other than just hours worked and pay earned. So if work was meaningful, if it was a meaningful occupation, it didn't matter so much whether or not people were paid. So this paper sort of like highlighted for me, and one of the main outcomes from this is the importance of evaluating subjectively rated success in vocational rehabilitation after traumatic brain injury, as well as these objective measures. It also highlighted for me, as my first sort of foray into qualitative research, the potential value of listening to people's lived experiences and learning from them in order to inform the work we do as health professionals. Some years later, I went on to do this thing called a qualitative metasynthesis with colleagues from AUT, Nick Kays and Joe Fadil, who I've continued to work with over the years. And in this particular systematic review, we were pooling the studies from multiple qualitative reviews looking at people's experiences of loss and recovery after traumatic brain injury. Because we're pooling multiple qualitative studies are often criticised by quantitative researchers for having small numbers of participants. This particular systematic review ended up pulling stories from the lived experiences of 260 people. And from this particular systematic review of qualitative evidence, we developed this sort of model that is just a way of reflecting on the sort of factors and events and outcomes that relate to this experience of recovery after traumatic brain injury. Now, one thing I pointed out in this particular paper, and I'll point out to you now, is that we have some really good ways of evaluating and measuring clinically aspects of these sorts of outcomes. So we have clinical measures that look at people's mind and problems with their mind and with their body. We have measures that look at people's emotional responses to brain injury. We even have measures of loss and reconstruction of people's place in the world through measures such as the Community Reintegration Questionnaire. And we have ways of evaluating the degree of support that people have. But one of the things that sort of like came out of this particular bit of work was the importance of loss and reconstruction of self-identity after traumatic brain injury. And at the time, it struck me that we didn't have any really good way of evaluating change in self-identity after traumatic brain injury, and yet it seemed to be something that was quite fundamentally important to people in their stories they were telling about recovery from traumatic brain injury. So this resulted in a question about whether or not we needed a measure of problems with or strength of self-identity after traumatic brain injury. And at the time that I was at this stage of thinking about things, I wondered whether it was even possible to create a measure of something as abstract as self-identity. So this led to a series of studies, and it would be a good hour lecture just to go through all these in detail. So I'm just going to touch on a few things. But this is the sort of the broad process that was followed. So we started with this qualitative metasynthesis, and then the next study I conducted was a grounded theory study throughout New Zealand, looking at people's lived experiences of change in self-identity after traumatic brain injury. And then there were these other studies as well, developing a concept that could be applied to measurement, and the development of a tool for mathematical testing. So the first study was this grounded theory study, looking at the experiences of 49 people with mild to severe traumatic brain injury from 8 regions throughout New Zealand. We held 2 Māori-specific focus groups, and we were looking at people's sort of experiences of how they made sense of themselves as individuals after what makes you you, your sense of self and your self-identity. One of the things that I was really struck by this particular bit of work was how, well, the first thing was that everybody we spoke to had an immediate response to this thing. I wondered whether the concept would be too abstract for people with traumatic brain injury to really engage in, but everybody talked about it. The concept of, I feel like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, came up on more than one occasion spontaneously. And the other thing that was really interesting was that people's problems with self-identity weren't just short-term, that I was talking to people 3 to 4 years after injury, even up to 10 years after injury, that were having these ongoing problems with knowing who they are. So there's a quote here from someone who was 8 years after traumatic brain injury who said that it's probably only last year that I'm actually accepting that other person, my self prior to injury, was somebody else, and I'm a new me now. But that's a new thing for me. So this is 8 years after traumatic brain injury. So from this work, we developed a kind of a way of understanding a loss and change of self-identity after traumatic brain injury, and this provided a framework for development of a measurement tool. Very, very quickly, the central concept here for this measurement tool was around feeling like an integrated, valued person, where all the parts of your life sort of make sense and connect together. And that there were 3 components to this. One component related to having a coherent, satisfying, complete sense of oneself, because traumatic brain injury, you lose things like memory of parts of your life. Feeling respected and validated and accepted by others, so how other people treat you has a direct impact on your self-identity. And also having a valued place in the world that was important. So where you fit. I was fortunate enough after that particular study to recruit Emily Thomas as a PhD student, and she went on to do the concept analysis and that we used to develop a battery of potential measurement items, and then she used those measurement items with about 130, 140 people, and did this particular mathematical approach called rationalysis in order to develop this brain injury sense of self scale. And this brain injury sense of self scale, because we've gone through this process of validation and rationalysis, is an interval scale, which means that we can add the numbers up that it produces and use those numbers for means and averages and that sort of thing. The other interesting thing about this scale is that it's a point-in-time measure, so none of the questions require people to try and remember what they were like before. It's just asking them about their sense of identity at this point in time. So it's got questions like here, I've got a clear idea who I am, I feel like I'm trying to be somebody I'm not, I accept myself who I am, that sort of thing. So this measurement tool is now available for use for evaluating the effectiveness of interventions to improve or address problems with self-identity. Second story I want to tell you is about change of tact here around goal setting and rehabilitation. So goal setting and rehabilitation was the subject of my PhD, and I had the very good fortune to be supervised by three fabulous people, Professor Kath McPherson, Professor Richard Seagate and Professor Sarah Dean. These people have all been extremely good mentors throughout my career, and I'm frequently drawing on their expertise still to this day. My goal setting story is another quite big complicated one that I'm going to try and squeeze into a very short period of time. I'm going to pull out a few themes that I've found interesting over the years. First thing to know about goal setting and rehabilitation is that it's considered one of the cornerstones of rehabilitation. So we are supposed to use goal setting when we are going through a rehabilitation process in order to find out what's meaningful to people and to use that to guide our clinical decision making so that we help people progress towards an outcome from rehabilitation that's individually meaningful to them. So you have 10 different people with a stroke, and they'll have 10 different things, 10 different lives that they're trying to return to. Some people have stairs, some people trying to return to work, some people have grandchildren they're looking after, and so forth. Now, a number of parts of my study ended up coming back to this question about what's the purpose of goal setting, and how is goal setting supposed to achieve its effects? The reason why I ended up with this particular question was if we were trying to pick from the multitude of different approaches to goal setting that are out there in the literature, and we wanted to do a study in order to test whether or not our approach to goal setting was effective or not, we would have to have some understanding about what we're trying to achieve. And so some of my studies involved asking patients and health professionals about what's the reason for doing goal setting. You say it's important, why is it so important? And the interesting thing here is that there's a large number of different answers to this particular question. Some people talk about goal setting as a way of improving teamwork and communication within interprofessional teams. People talk about goal setting as a way of building a therapeutic relationship with patients. People talk about goal setting as being motivating, about self-regulating behaviour. People also talk about goal setting, involving patients in goal setting as a way of involving people in clinical decision making, so empowering them and enhancing their self-determination. And also people use goal setting, achievement of goals, as a way to evaluate outcomes. Rehabilitation funders like ACC have a expectation that goals are collected and reported on as well. So sometimes there is a legislative or contractual requirement to set goals. So one of my papers was looking at, one of my studies was looking at the interrelationship between these different types of themes. Some of these themes relate to the relationship between healthcare providers and funders. Some of them relate to the relationships within interprofessional teams, and some of them relate to the relationships between health professionals and patients. And the interesting thing here is that, I keep saying the interesting thing, there's lots of interesting things obviously. The interesting thing here is that some of these reasons for using goal setting interact. So for example, we might have an idea that if we involve patients in goal setting, they might therefore be more motivated to engage in the rehabilitation process. So goal setting for the purposes of self-determination and patient motivation can be act synergistically. But other reasons for using goal setting can sometimes conflict as well. So, for instance, if we're using goal setting to demonstrate to a funder like ACC that we've been successful in achieving our objectives of delivery of rehabilitation, then we're going to be less inclined to want to let patients set goals for themselves if they want to pick goals that we think are either hard to achieve or even impossible to achieve. And so, depending on what reason we're using goal setting, it can have an impact on how we go about goal setting. In fact, one of the other things that comes out of this particular research is the observation that their conflicts within teams can occur when team members have different ideas about what the primary purpose of goal setting is. This comes to the question of which approach to goal setting is effective, and is goal setting a good use of time in clinical rehabilitation? Should we just do physiotherapy and forget about goal setting, or occupational therapy and forget about goal setting altogether? And so to answer that question, I undertook a systematic review through the Cochrane Library. A systematic review is a way of pooling the results from multiple studies that have asked similar kinds of questions to get a more statistically powerful, statistically informative answer. This here is called a forest plot. Oh, I'm not allowed to wander away. Yeah, so visualize a forest plot. It's trees, but as a graph. This is where you find I've changed outfits when the light come on again. So anyway, in the dark here, just imagine you are a rehabilitation researcher looking at a picture of a forest plot. And I guess the main finding from this particular systematic review was that there was some evidence, evidence that if you involve patients in goal setting, it does seem to have a impact on their self-reported quality of life and their emotional status. So people feel better after rehabilitation when the rehabilitation has involved an explicit approach to goal setting versus when rehabilitation has been offered as kind of a standardized approach to everybody with no discussion of goals. And similarly, involvement of patients in goal setting has a positive impact on people's self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is people's belief in their ability to achieve things that they set out to achieve. But there's very little studies actually, but of the studies that exist, there's no evidence that adding an approach to goal setting to rehabilitation has any actual impact on the functional outcomes that people achieve. Now, I would speculate that this is quite possibly because of the types of approaches to goal setting that have been used in these studies that have been tested, but more research would need to be conducted in order to change this particular conclusion. So this raises a question about whether or not these sort of self-reported subjective improvements merit investing a lot of time in goal setting in a rehabilitation setting. So this is something for rehabilitation teams to think about. And that answer to that question, I think, comes back to this question about what is the main purpose of goal setting. If the main purpose of goal setting is to empower people and involve them in clinical decision making, then maybe it doesn't matter whether or not it actually has an impact on health outcomes. Which brings me to ADOC, the Aid for Decision Making and Occupational Choice. So sometime probably around 2015, 2016, I was at one of these international conferences that you could attend prior to COVID, and this guy from Japan, Konosuke Tomori, approached me to show me, I was presenting about goal setting, to show me the app that he had designed that was being used in Japan in order to facilitate engagement with patients and health professionals around the selection of goals for rehabilitation. This app had a range of different sorts of outcomes that people might want to be working towards, and it addressed a common problem, which was that patients tend to let health professionals take charge when it involves setting goals, and health professionals tend to take charge when anybody gives them a chance to. So one of the problems with this particular app for use in New Zealand was that it was in Japanese, and some of the images and content of the app also related to very Japanese kinds of activities as well. So we went through a process where, with collaborators all around the world, we developed an English language version of this particular app, which we field tested, and we published the results of this in BMJ Open. And we've since gone on to develop a Māori Pacific version of this app as well. I now have a PhD student, Carla Strubio, is around here somewhere, whose PhD is about testing the English language version of this app in Auckland Hospital, Hutt Valley Hospital, and Capital Coast, ABI Rehabilitation. And there's also Kato McDonald there, who's doing a BMed Sci, looking at some of the initial experiences of people at Wanganui DHB to test the Māori Pacific version of this app as well. The Māori Pacific version of this app was built in collaboration with some fantastic colleagues of mine, Tristram Ingham, Bernadette Jones, and Diana Sikapatanu. and when we built this app, we took the English language app to community members and Māori and Pacific communities to ask them about the content and stuff. And interestingly, you can see in that picture from the Japanese to the English version, there's just the English version was drawn by a Japanese illustrator, but we've changed from chopsticks to a knife and fork for eating. But when we took this app with these images and this content to Māori and Pacific people, they said, oh, those people are way too skinny. And also, there's not enough colour. Also, you need more people in those. Images, and there needs to be more colour on the walls behind. There needs to be more family there as well. I should say, initially they said, "Oh no, that's fabulous. That's great. Don't do anything. It's fine. But if you were going to change something, fatten those people up. They look like they're going to die." So this is just a screenshot from the Māori Pacific version of this particular app. And I'm just going to flick you a couple of other images because I just love these so much. These images have been drawn by Maui Studios, and some of the content is the same content as the Japanese app, just with kind of a more sort of Aotearoa kind of focus of the content. But some of the content has been changed as well. So you can see up on the top right there's Kihorahi as a sport that's sort of been added in as well. Also, one of the nice advantages of working with people from Japan is that I was able to get a New Zealand-Japanese partnership a grant from the Royal Society Te Apuranga and the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science, and this has allowed us to spend time in each other's countries, sharing our experiences and developing our ideas together. And this is just a picture from early this year, again pre-COVID. One of the wonderful things you could do pre-COVID, we went to Able Tasman. On the right-hand side there's Konosuke Tomori. And in the middle is Onokanta, and then on the right is Tasunori Sawada, and we had a great 3 days in Able Tasman on one of our weekends off our hard work. So my third story, I'm going to have to speed up probably, my third story is around rehabilitation for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. COPD is the fourth leading cause of death in New Zealand, and lots of people don't know that. I always think of it as the fourth cab off the ranks. And for that reason, it often doesn't get quite so much attention as heart disease, stroke, and diabetes. It's the fifth leading cause of total years lived with disability globally, and it costs New Zealand $80 million in acute admissions to hospital alone. So it's an expensive intervention. And it affects a large proportion of our population over 40. There is an intervention called pulmonary rehabilitation, which has such a strong evidence base supporting its use that the Cochrane collaboration came to the conclusion that they weren't going to update that systematic review anymore, and they said stop doing clinical trials to test whether or not pulmonary rehabilitation works or not, because you're not going to be able to produce new evidence that's going to change our conclusions. So pulmonary rehabilitation is known to increase exercise capacity for people with chronic lung disease and reduce rehospitalisation rates, and yet in a study, an audit of pulmonary rehabilitation in New Zealand that I conducted in 2009, I found that only 0.5%, half of 1% of the total population of people with COPD receive pulmonary rehabilitation every year. So we'd have to provide pulmonary rehabilitation for 200 years to provide pulmonary rehabilitation for all the people in New Zealand with COPD, which is clearly kind of a problem. The other thing here is that there's an interesting sort of like drop-off in terms of when people are offered a space in a pulmonary rehabilitation program, only 30% of them take that opportunity up, and then of the numbers who take it up, only a small percentage of them, a number of them sort of don't complete as well. And so this raises questions about what things would help or hinder people to engage in pulmonary rehabilitation. And again, another qualitative study that I've conducted with colleagues Tristram Ingham and Bernadette Jones and Rebecca Granger and Pauline Boland and Melanie Brown was a study looking at people's views and experiences about what helps and hinders them to engage in pulmonary rehabilitation. We interviewed Māori and non-Māori people who had participated in mainstream hospital-based pulmonary rehabilitation, and we interviewed Māori people who had participated in a by-Māori, for-Māori, marae-based pulmonary rehabilitation program as well. What we found was that there were a number of common experiences across Māori and non-Māori people that were sort of common to everybody, things that influenced their willingness to engage in pulmonary rehabilitation. But overlaying this was a Māori context that had an additional sort of impact in terms of the willingness of Māori people to take up or engage in pulmonary rehabilitation when it was offered to them. Central to this particular thing, there was a number of factors that I could go into, but central to it was the idea of whakawhanaungatanga, which very, very, very loosely translates as making culturally meaningful connections with other people. And when this was absent from mainstream hospital-based pulmonary rehabilitation programs, Māori participants were less likely to want to come along or to continue when they first attended. And I've gone on here, and I don't have time to talk about it, to try and democratize pulmonary rehabilitation with the use of Nintendo Wii in people's homes, which I call rehabilitation and pulmonary rehabilitation, and more recently investigating an intervention called Taking Charge to try and engage more with people who'd been hospitalised for COPD as well. Currently, I'm also engaging another one of these qualitative metasynthesis to try and pull data from countries all around the world who've asked this question: why do people not come when you invite them, and how can we increase the referral rate and the uptake rate? This is ongoing work. So finally, I'm wondering about the time, but I want to talk a little bit about some of my work with Cochrane Rehabilitation. I should definitely say, anybody who's called in from Europe, shout out to my Cochrane Rehabilitation whānau, and also to my friends and whānau from Japan as well. So Cochrane is an important organisation in the world. It's linked to the work of the World Health Organization. It's a global group. It's fiercely independent, and it's a non-profit organisation. It's basically a network of researchers, professionals, patients, carers, and other people interested in health. It exists so that healthcare decisions get better, and it focuses on producing syntheses of evidence around specific research questions. In 2016, I joined a collaboration of people to help establish a new specialty, a field in Cochrane Rehabilitation, in rehabilitation called Cochrane Rehabilitation. And the purpose of this group was to act as a two-way bridge to try and disseminate more information from the Cochrane Library to our rehabilitation community, but also to inform the work of Cochrane from the perspective of rehabilitation stakeholders. Because often the methodologies that have been developed by Cochrane over the years have been designed primarily with drug trials in mind, and they don't necessarily fit very well when your intervention is a behavioural intervention that you can't blind and you can't provide a placebo pill for. So there are a number of objectives of Cochrane Rehabilitation, and the two that I've probably been most involved in is development of a register of rehabilitation reviews within the Cochrane Library, and development of review methods to try and improve the types of information that Cochrane produces for rehabilitation providers. One of these bits of work involved development of a online relational database where I could crowdsource the classification of rehabilitation reviews within the Cochrane Library. Cochrane Library has over 10,000 reviews, and we now have a system set up where we've classified all of those, and we've tagged them within the Cochrane system as being about rehabilitation or not, and which rehabilitation professionals are involved. And this international group of people who collaborate to this tagging work keep this updated on a regular basis. This tagging work informs other work within the Cochrane community around dissemination, production of textbooks on rehabilitation evidence, on informing how we define what is and what isn't rehabilitation, and it's going to be used in order to improve the way you can access rehabilitation information within the Cochrane Library. Also, another grant from Royal Society Te Aparanga involved leading two-day workshop prior to a conference in Paris, hard life we lead, to get a bunch of people from a number of different countries all around the world to look at the different aspects of the way we produce evidence in systematic reviews in order to challenge sort of common perceptions about those sorts of things, and to develop new ways of looking at these sorts of questions from a rehabilitation perspective rather than a drug trial kind of perspective. One of my contributions to this particular bit of body of work was a closer look at how control groups are managed within clinical trials, and I'm not going to go into any more detail. Other than to say that this methodology group, this is the inaugural meeting of this particular methodology group, and it's now met every year for the last 3 years as a result of this initial first meeting, and we've been progressing towards improving reporting standards for clinical trials in the rehabilitation field and other work. Cochrane Rehabilitation also does some phenomenal work with regard to synthesis of evidence around rehabilitation after COVID. So, in summary, rehabilitation is an important part of the health sector, and there is increasing need for it internationally and within New Zealand. And the international rehabilitation community is becoming more organised and coordinated around research collaborations, and this has included questioning about how we should go about doing and using research to inform clinical practice. But there remains a high need for local research to address inequalities, particularly for our Māori and Pacific populations. And this requires more than just research. It requires social political action as well, in addition to the research to create change. And organisations like the New Zealand Rehabilitation Association that I'm involved in is a good forum for pushing some of those agendas forward. So I should say in my new role going forward as an employee of University of Otago, I do feel a bit of a weight of responsibility in my new role as Dean here on this campus, but it's a good weight which feels satisfying. And I'm wanting to use this responsibility to create an environment in which other researchers, particularly our Māori Pacific researchers, can thrive, and so that we can produce the workforce that we need going forward in the future in New Zealand. I have a few thank yous to finish with. Thanks to the people the organisations that have funded my work over the years, the Health Research Council, the Royal Society Te Aparanga, Asthma Respiratory Foundation, Lotteries Health, and Otago, University of Otago too has provided funding grants for me from time to time. I've got a large number of people to thank, so I won't read from this list. I've fantastic collaborations from all around the world, and it's going to be an interesting challenge for up-and-coming researchers to build these sorts of connections when our international opportunities to meet have reduced. It's much harder to have that sort of spontaneous networking that occurs at conferences. So I think the best part of conferences is the lunch, where you get a chance to talk to people about their research, and that's where a lot of my collaborations have sprung from. They haven't sprung from emails or anything like that. It's been the social chit-chat as well. I also like to take this opportunity to thank my mum and dad for the opportunities they gave me, and I always cry when I talk about my family. And also to my children, Gilbert and Eva and Casper, who's sitting there looking terribly embarrassed. And this is the longest I've seen any of them without a phone, so that's been a significant achievement. But finally, I'd like to thank my whaiaiapo, Joe, for being amazing.
Mate
We're not angry at him. It is a salute from Ngāti Toa to you for your work you're currently doing and the discussions that you have embarked on with the iwi. They feel confident that their aspirations are going to be realised in the ways that we're talking about things now. So on behalf of Ngāti Toa, Te Atiawa, Ngāti Raukawa, that's a pathway that we see as the right way. We thank you.
Kia ora. Kia ora. Tēnā koutou katoa. My name is David Murdoch. I'm the Dean of University of Otago's Christchurch campus, and believe me, William, you're not the only one fighting back tears at the moment. I have a role that's very brief but very important, and that's to give a vote of thanks. And firstly, I just really want to thank everyone for the invitation today. This is an absolute pleasure for me to be and privilege to be here. Not only to be here in person, but actually to be part of the academic party. And as Anna said, this has been quite a year. It's quite a year to start as a dean. And indeed, we have two deans, with Ravenswood, Romanian and Dunedin as well, starting this year, and what a chaotic year it's been. And it probably won't surprise you to know that the deans that contribute to the Otago Medical School usually have a fairly close relationship. And particularly the deans of the two northern campuses in Christchurch and Wellington, we face similar challenges and issues and usually develop a very close relationship. But this year, I think this is the second time we've met each other in person. Otherwise it's by Zoom, which really does not cut the mustard with relationships. So really wonderful to be here. Thank everyone for coming, for colleagues, for friends, for whānau, but of course the main thanks for you, William, for a fantastic presentation. Thank you for, wonderful to get to know you a bit more through that, to see your passion. I am impressed at your ability to think on the spot when the light goes out. I think most people would have stopped, but you kept going. That was impressive. But really, thank you for taking us into your world. So wonderful to be here, and what a great talk. One last thing, we have a gift. So as a memory, so thank you in the usual way, but here is a gift to the members.